Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive? Today, we're heading to southern India.
Sounds fascinating.
It is. We're looking at the religious landscape, specifically between 300 and 1200 CE.
Ah, so that's the period with those incredible temples.
You got it. Grand temples, unique local deities, and a real mixing of different faiths, creating a distinct southern flavor.
I've always been curious about that blend of influences. What makes it so unique?
Well, just imagine this. Some temples from this era were built to resemble giant mountains.
Mountains, what's the significance there?
They symbolized a sacred journey, ascending to the heavens.
Wow, that's powerful imagery. Talk about art and faith intertwining.
Exactly. And these temples weren't just places of worship.
Right, I've heard they were like centers of life, social, economic, even political.
Absolutely. So we're talking about a shift from those earlier Vedic rituals to this temple-based worship. Tell me more about that transition.
Well, temples took center stage, and their architecture reflected this change. The Dravidian style emerged, think towering gateways called Gopurams.
I've seen pictures. They're covered in intricate carvings, right?
Every surface.
Yeah.
And then there's the central tower, the Vimana.
Ah, yes, the Vimana. What's its significance?
It often represented Mount Meru,
Mount Meru.
the mythical abode of the gods.
So they were bringing the heavens down to earth.
You could say that.
Incredible. But what about the deities worshipped in these temples? Were they the same gods worshipped in the north?
Not exactly. Alongside familiar figures like Vishnu and Shiva,
The big names, yeah.
you had a whole host of local deities, each with unique myths and powers.
Fascinating. Can you give us an example?
Take the goddess Kottravai.
Kottravai, okay.
She was a fierce warrior goddess associated with victory and protection.
So she was popular among warriors.
Absolutely. Often depicted riding a tiger armed with weapons.
Wow, fierce indeed.
Her stories resonated with people, connecting them to the land and their heritage.
It's so interesting how these local deities were woven into the religious fabric alongside the more recognized gods.
Exactly. And that brings us to syncretism, the blending of different religious ideas.
So it's not about replacing beliefs, but merging them.
More like incorporating and adapting them into a unique tapestry.
I like that, a tapestry.
Yeah.
So we have these magnificent temples, a mix of deities, and this idea of syncretism. How did this blending play out in everyday life?
One key aspect was the bhakti movement,
Right, the Bhakti movement.
emphasizing a personal connection with the chosen deity.
And those Tamil poet saints, the Alvars and Nayanars, their hymns were so central to that movement.
Absolutely. Expressions of love and devotion, they became central to rituals and practice. These hymns weren't just confined to temples. They spread through communities, uniting people through shared devotion.
Like a soundtrack of religious fervor.
Exactly.
So we have amazing temples, diverse deities, and the Bhakti movement's intensity. But what was it actually like to experience faith during this time?
Picture this. You're surrounded by elaborate temple rituals and festivals.
Oh, I love festival.
Imagine grand processions, music, dance, offerings,
A real spectacle.
all designed to honor the deities and involve the entire community.
It sounds vibrant. But were these events purely spiritual? Or did they have social and political implications too?
You're spot on. These rituals also reinforced social hierarchies. The priestly class, for instance, their power was on full display, and rulers used their patronage of temples and festivals to, well, legitimize their power and connect with their subjects.
So interwoven with spiritual significance.
Exactly. To understand this era's religious landscape, you have to consider these interconnected elements.
It's fascinating how religion, politics, and social structures were so intertwined.
Absolutely.
This paints such a vivid picture, but I'm curious to go deeper. Can we talk about specific examples of these local deities and how they fit into the broader pantheon?
That's a great question, and it takes us to one of the most fascinating aspects of this period, the way local deities were integrated with the more familiar gods.
Like Vishnu and Shiva.
Exactly. It blurred the lines between local and pan-Indian traditions.
Okay, I'm hooked. Tell me more. How did this integration work? Did these local deities become aspects of the major gods, or did they keep their distinct identities?
Well, there wasn't one set way. Some local deities were seen as manifestations or regional forms of Vishnu or Shiva.
Taking on their attributes and stories.
Precisely.
So it wasn't just adding new deities, it was about weaving them into the existing belief system.
Exactly. And this wasn't just some abstract theological concept. It played out in the art, the architecture, the rituals, even personal beliefs.
It's like we're uncovering this intricate tapestry of beliefs and practices.
And we're just getting started. There's so much more to explore. But before we dive into specifics, I'm curious, what's standing out to you so far? What's sparking your interest?
Honestly, it's that fusion, that syncretism, that's really grabbing me.
Well,
It's not just deities coexisting. It's more like they're blending and evolving,
right.
taking on new roles. It feels dynamic, not rigid at all.
It's a great observation, and it really gets at the heart of religious life back then in southern India. It wasn't about strict adherence, to one belief system. It was about weaving together different threads, making connections, and creating something new and relevant.
So you're saying it was more about experiencing faith than following strict doctrines.
Exactly. And speaking of different strands, this era wasn't just temples and rituals.
Right. There was a lot of philosophy going on too, right?
Intense philosophical inquiry, all sorts of schools of thought flourishing, debating reality, consciousness, paths to liberation, the whole works.
Oh, yeah. The outline mentioned those philosophical schools. What were some of the key ideas floating around? And were they connected to the temple stuff and the Bhakti movement?
One that stands out is the Madhyamaka school of Buddhist philosophy. They really challenged the idea of inherent existence.
Inherent existence.
Yeah, they argued that things don't have an independent, fixed reality. Everything is interconnected, constantly changing, and ultimately empty of inherent essence.
Whoa. Empty of inherent essence. That's a lot to unpack. How did people even process such abstract ideas? Was this just an intellectual elite thing, or did it filter down to everyday life?
Well, remember that vibrant intellectual atmosphere we talked about? It wasn't just ivory tower discussions. Imagine gatherings of scholars, Buddhists, Jains, different Hindu philosophies, all debating.
Debating what?
Oh, consciousness, paths to liberation, even the existence of a soul.
Wow, lively debates. Where would they have these?
Temples, royal courts, even public spaces.
So this intense philosophical debate happening against the backdrop of these magnificent temples and the Bhakti movement. Did these ideas impact how people practice their faith?
It's a tough question, and something scholars are still debating, but there was definitely a cross-pollination of ideas. The Bhakti movement's emphasis on personal experience might have resonated with the Madhyamaka's focus on the impermanence and interconnectedness of everything.
It's amazing to think about those connections. All these different strands of thought weaving together. It makes you wonder about the impact on ordinary people. We've talked about kings and scholars, but what about the everyday experiences of, say, farmers, merchants, artisans? How do they engage with these religious and philosophical ideas?
To understand their lives, we look at inscriptions.
Inscriptions.
Yeah, these inscriptions, often found on temple walls or copper plates, offer glimpses into the social and economic realities of the time. And they weren't just about kings and elites. They tell us about everyday folks, their jobs, families, beliefs, even aspirations.
It's like we're putting together a puzzle, right? We've got these grand narratives of empires, philosophical debates, and religious movements. And then these inscriptions offer these intimate personal details, human stories that bring the past to life.
Exactly. Imagine an inscription detailing a donation to a temple by a weaver's guild.
Okay.
It might list the names of individual weavers, how much they gave, even their hopes for a good harvest or the well-being of their families.
It's like stepping back in time, standing with those weavers, feeling their devotion. It makes history so much more real, relatable.
That's the power of these inscriptions. They help us connect with the lived experiences of people who might otherwise be forgotten. By understanding their stories, we get a richer understanding of the religious landscape. It's not just temples and doctrines, it's about the human hearts, the hopes and dreams that animated their faith.
So it seems like this religious landscape was incredibly diverse and dynamic. But were there any unifying factors, any common threads that ran through the various beliefs and practices?
One that stands out is the importance of devotion and personal experience, whether it was through temple rituals, the Bhakti saints' hymns, or even philosophical inquiry. There seems to have been this shared desire to connect with the divine, to experience the sacred directly.
Interesting. So while the specific deities and philosophical schools varied, there was a common yearning for this direct personal connection with the divine.
Exactly. And this focus on personal experience still resonates with people today, not just in India, but around the world. Think about pilgrimage, devotional singing, even practices like yoga and meditation. They all tap into that yearning for a direct connection with something bigger than ourselves.
It's fascinating how these ancient traditions continue to influence and inspire us centuries later. And speaking of influence, I'd like to touch on the political side a bit more. We talked about rulers using temple patronage and festivals to legitimize their power. But can we get into a specific example? The outline mentioned the Cholas. They were a major power during this time, right?
The Cholas are a perfect example of how political power and religious patronage were intertwined. Their rise wasn't just about military strength. It was also about strategically using temple building and supporting the Bhakti movement.
So they were smart, using religion to solidify their power and connect with people.
Absolutely. Take the Brihadisvara temple at Thanjavur, built by the Chola king Raja I.
Oh, that's the one that's massive, right?
It's a masterpiece of Dravidian architecture, a towering symbol of Chola power and piety. But it wasn't just about size. The carvings, the rituals, its location, all of it projected Chola power and shaped the religious landscape.
Every time I see pictures of that temple, I'm blown away by its scale. It's like a monument to ambition and devotion. But it also makes me think about the people who built it, the artisans, the laborers. What do we know about their experiences?
That's a great question, and it highlights the importance of looking beyond the grand narratives. Luckily, we have inscriptions from the Brihadisvara temple itself that give us insights into their lives.
So we can learn about the people who actually built this incredible structure.
We learn about the different guilds of artisans involved: sculptors, stonecutters, metalworkers, the wages they were paid, even the villages that supplied the materials, the logistics of transporting the massive stones, the whole complex organization.
It's amazing how these inscriptions bring us closer to the human side of these monumental events.
Exactly. By piecing together all these different sources, the narratives, the philosophies, the inscriptions, the art itself, we start to create a much richer, more nuanced understanding of this era.
So we've covered a lot: temples, deities, philosophy, even politics. What a journey. Before we wrap up, any thoughts for our listeners, something to ponder? Those personal stories for me, those weavers making their donations, hoping for a good harvest, it makes you realize it's not just about grand temples or big philosophies. It's about the people, their hopes, their struggles. It makes it all so human.
It really does. And that's what makes this period so captivating. It's about connecting with those individuals, understanding their lives.
And those hopes and dreams, they didn't just vanish, did they? They shaped southern India's cultural identity. I mean, we still see it today, right?
Oh, absolutely. The legacy of this era is everywhere. The architecture, the devotional practices, the philosophical ideas, they all resonate even today, not just in India, but globally.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, any final thoughts for our listeners? Something to keep them thinking, maybe encourage further exploration?
Well, given all this richness and diversity in southern India, I'd ask, how did these traditions interact with other parts of India, even beyond? What were the connections, the clashes, the lasting impacts of this exchange?
Wow, that's a great question. It reminds us that southern India wasn't in a bubble. It was connected to a wider world, sharing ideas, beliefs, practices, just one chapter in the ongoing story of humanity.
And as we keep exploring those chapters, we'll find new connections, challenge old assumptions, and gain a deeper understanding of the human experience.
Well said. So on that note, we'll bring this deep dive to a close. But remember, the exploration doesn't end here. There's always more to discover. Until next time, keep diving deep.